and welcome to the Stress Rewire clinical briefing. I'm so excited to have all of you here. My name is Miriam and I am a functional nutritionist. I am also a gut hormone specialist, and my work centers basically around women in perimenopause, menopause, in that transition. So basically women 40 and older. Today, I just want you to know it is not a webinar. This is basically a clinical briefing, okay? And that distinction matters. I'll explain more about that, exactly why, in a moment. But before I get into the content, I want to do a couple of things, okay? So, first and foremost, I want to name who is in this room. I think that is extremely important. I can tell from those of you who sent in your registrations that we have women across all 5 gut hormone patterns here with us this evening. We have Cortisol-Wired, Insulin-Inflamed, T3 downregulated, Estrogen-Stuck, and Estrobolome-Disrupted. Many of you are a combination. Okay, so you're carrying a primary and a secondary, and for a few of you, I've noticed that you have even a tertiary. There are 3. You're carrying 3. Now, this is exactly why the archetype framework exists. The biology that I'm going to walk through hits each of those patterns differently. I'm going to make it specific to you. Okay, so not to women in general, but specific to you. Now, for those of you who have already taken the gut hormone quiz, I want you to know that the link is going to be below in the chat for those of you who have not taken it. That's what I meant to say. So I'm going to post that link because I really want you to start there. You can take it this evening after tonight's call, or you can pause and go take it before we hit the archetype section this evening. So it takes about 4 minutes. It will make the second half of tonight significantly more specific to your situation. The second thing is that I want you to know that today's link for this recording, it will be emailed directly to you. So you will get a copy of the replay. And I also will have this living within our online community, the Nourish and Flow Circle. For those of you who don't know, it is free to join. And I'm mentioning this before we start, not at the end. So you can share tonight's registration link with anyone who signed up but couldn't make it live, okay? So the recording will be waiting for them within our community, and I also will send it to everyone who registered directly to your email. All right, and the third thing, I want to give you one job for the next 60 or so minutes. Your job is to find your mechanism, not the biology in general, not is this interesting or does this apply to women broadly, your specific pattern in what I'm about to teach. So there is one question I want you to keep in front of you the entire time that we're together. Which part of this is mine? That single question will make everything we cover this evening far more actionable than, say, notes alone, okay? All right, y'all. So let's go. Now, I want to start with a question. I get asked more than almost any other. Why did stress stop working? Not why am I stressed? Not why did the approaches that used to help with stress stop producing results? The yoga, the walking, the better sleep routine, the evening wind down, maybe even the magnesium. I know quite a bit of us are on the magnesium, but for some of us, it's just not working like it used to. Somewhere in the early to mid 40s, for most women, the same practices produced diminishing returns, sometimes no returns at all. And the answer is not that those practices became ineffective. The answer is that the physiology they were designed for shifted underneath them. Now, that shift has a name. I call it the cortisol drift. So today I'm going to show you exactly what it is and why reversing it requires a different sequence than the one that most women have been following. See if I can make this bigger. All right. Yeah, I was able to make it bigger. So let's keep going. All right. So Section 1, the biology, y'all. This is where we are right now. The estrogen-cortisol buffer. Now, here is the foundational mechanism. In a woman's reproductive years, estrogen plays a critical role in regulating the stress response. It does this primarily at the level of the hypothalamus, the brain structure that acts as the control tower for cortisol production. Estrogen exerts an inhibitory effect on the HPA axis. The HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is the three gland system that produces cortisol in response to stress. It does this through a specific receptor, the glucocorticoid receptor. Now, think of these receptors as the brain's enough cortisol glucocorticoid receptor, or sensors. They read the current cortisol level and signal the HPA axis to stand down. Estrogen keeps those receptors well populated and sensitive. When estrogen is present and cycling, it helps modulate how reactive the stress response is. It acts as a buffer. It does not eliminate stress responses, it calibrates them, helps cortisol spike to a level that is proportionate to the stressor, and then helps the system return to baseline afterward. That return to baseline is the part that matters most. A healthy stress response is not just a spike, it is a spike and a recovery. The buffer doesn't only limit how high cortisol goes, it determines how quickly the system settles back down. This is the protection that perimenopause, that transition, it quietly removes. Now, not all at once. Gradually, the estrogen buffer begins to degrade in the early perimenopause transition, often years before the last period. Sometimes as early as age 38 or 39 in women with earlier onset patterns. As that buffer thins, three things happen simultaneously. One, the cortisol response to any given stressor gets larger in amplitude. Two, sorry about my dogs. Two, the recovery time, the return to baseline, it lengthens. And three, the baseline itself begins to rise. You end up with a system that is spiking higher, recovering slower, and starting from a higher floor than it used to. That is the cortisol drift. Now, this is not a clinical hypothesis, okay? It is documented in literature. The SWAN study, the study of women's health across the nation, is one of the most comprehensive longitudinal studies of midlife women ever conducted. When researchers examined HPA axis reactivity across the menopausal transition specifically, they found this pattern consistently. Perimenopausal women showed measurably greater cortisol reactivity to standardized stressors than premenopausal women of comparable age. Greater reactivity, longer recovery, higher floor. Now, one finding I return to repeatedly in practice: late evening cortisol. In a healthy cortisol diurnal curve, cortisol should be reaching its lowest point, the nadir, sometime around midnight to 2 a.m. In perimenopausal women without the estrogen buffer, that nadir doesn't fully complete. Evening cortisol stays elevated. Now, that single finding explains more presenting symptom patterns than almost anything else in the literature. 3 a.m. waking. Cortisol cannot reach nadir. The body's nighttime recovery window is interrupted at its most critical point. Midsection weight accumulation, the visceral fat, the visceral adipose tissue, the fat that deposits around the abdomen. Now, that type of fat is particularly dense with cortisol receptors. Sustained elevation drives deposition and retention there, specifically independent of caloric intake. Anxiety, listen, anxiety without a clear trigger, when the baseline is elevated, the threshold for a stress activation response is lower. A stressor that would have been manageable, say 3 years ago, now tips the system into overwhelm. Not because you become fragile, okay? Because the buffer that calibrated your response has thinned. Now, here's the clinical consequence that most wellness education has not addressed, and this is where I want your full attention. Every stress approach you've tried, breath work, meditation, adaptogens, magnesium, sleep hygiene, lower intensity exercise, or gut protocols, was designed for a stress response system with an intact buffer. So you weren't doing it wrong. These approaches are not ineffective. They are designed for a different starting condition. When you do a breath practice and your cortisol temporarily drops, but your system has no modulatory mechanism to maintain that drop, it rebounds. Cortisol returns to the elevated floor almost immediately. You feel calmer during the practice. An hour later, you are back to exactly where you started. This is a physiological mismatch. Now, the drift means the system has shifted its set point. So, restoring cortisol resilience requires addressing that set point shift directly. Now, this is before layering interventions on top of it. That is what today is about. Now, one more mechanism before we move to the archetype patterns. This one is directly relevant to every woman who has noticed that her gut symptoms and her stress levels track each other. Elevated cortisol increases intestinal permeability. It weakens the tight junction proteins that maintain the gut barrier. When that barrier is compromised, a bacterial byproduct called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS for short, begins to translocate through the gut wall into systemic circulation. LPS is recognized by the immune system as a threat. Now, these endotoxins trigger an immune response that inflames the brain directly, further sensitizing the HPA axis, amplifying cortisol reactivity, which further increases gut permeability, which produces more LPS. This is a closed loop, it's self sustaining. That inflammatory response also degrades sleep architecture, specifically REM sleep, REM, the phase that's concentrated in the second half of the night when the brain performs synaptic pruning, organizing, consolidating, and clearing the cognitive and emotional processing from the day. When neural inflammation degrades REM quality, that clearing process is incomplete. So you wake with residue, cognitive fog, emotional reactivity, unprocessed stress that never fully cleared from the prior day. The gut and the nervous system are not separate problems. They are one loop, and they must be addressed as one loop. Before I take us into the archetype patterns, I want you to do something in the chat for me, okay? Drop one word or one phrase, a symptom or experience from what I've just described that feels most personally true for you right now. Listen, one word is enough, okay? 3 a.m., afternoon crash, midsection, fog, anxiety. So, excuse me, whatever resonates, okay? Go ahead and drop that in the chat. I'll give you a few more seconds. Listen, this is why I build protocols by pattern and not by symptom. The clinical sequence that rebuilds cortisol resilience in a cortisol-wired woman actively backfires in an estrogen-stuck one. The mechanisms are different. The cascade points are different. The entry point into the rebuild is different. The what I'm teaching you today applies across all 5 patterns. The what, okay? WHAT. The biology of the drift is the same. The how, HOW, the specific sequence for your specific physiology, that's where it gets personal. Now, there are 5 gut hormone archetypes in this framework, 5 distinct patterns of how the cortisol drift disrupts a woman's physiology. Most women carry one primary pattern, sometimes with a secondary pattern that overlaps. And as I mentioned earlier, in some cases, there's a tertiary pattern that overlaps the secondary. Okay? Now, I'm walking through all 5 today. The goal is not comprehensiveness, it's recognition. I want you to hear your pattern described in clinical terms, possibly for the first time. So keep your question in front of you. The question, remember, is which part of this is mine? The cortisol-wired pattern, the HPA axis is already dysregulated at baseline before the drift begins. These are women whose nervous systems have been running at high capacity for years, often high achieving women, often in demanding roles or caregiving situations, often described from the outside as the person who handles everything. The system was already producing elevated cortisol. Perimenopause removes the buffer that was quietly managing that baseline. The mechanism here is glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity. Remember those enough cortisol sensors I mentioned? In the cortisol-wired pattern, chronic cortisol exposure has desensitized them. The brain is producing fewer of them, and the ones it does produce respond less strongly. With fewer functional receptors, the signal that should close the HPA feedback loop, enough, stand down, it doesn't land clearly. The system runs high because it cannot read its own output. What the drift does, it raises the floor further. The system can no longer down-regulate between stressors. There is no recovery window. Now, the clinical hallmarks, 3 a.m., waking, that is consistent, not occasional. Also, midsection weight that does not respond to dietary change. Anxiety that presents without a clear external trigger because the threshold for stress activation has been set extremely low. And the wired but tired feeling, the particular exhaustion of a body that is simultaneously depleted and unable to rest. These women often function at high capacity until they suddenly cannot. The system compensates for a long time. Then it stops compensating. For cortisol wired, the tri-shift entry point is the nervous system axis, and the intervention logic is reduction based, not addition based. Okay? This is the most important clinical distinction for this pattern. Adding more protocols, more supplements, more interventions to a system already under load increases the burden. The work is removing load from the system first. The insulin-inflamed pattern, blood glucose dysregulation with underlying inflammatory load. Cortisol is the primary driver of hepatic glucose output. It signals the liver to release stored glucose into the bloodstream. In the short term, this is a survival mechanism. Under chronic elevation, it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem. Cortisol, okay? This is what we're talking about. Cortisol is repeatedly spiking glucose. Insulin responds each time. Over months and years, insulin receptor sensitivity decreases. Glucose stays elevated longer after each spike. The drift compounds this because cortisol responses are now larger in amplitude and slower to recover. Each stress activation produces a larger glucose spike and a more prolonged elevation. The inflammatory component is often missed. Cortisol is initially anti-inflammatory in the short term. Now, many women with this pattern do not present with obvious inflammation markers, but under chronic HPA activation, immune cells develop glucocorticoid resistance. The cortisol signal loses its immunosuppressive effect. Inflammation emerges. Joint symptoms, skin reactivity, digestive inflammation, despite the fact that cortisol is elevated. The clinical hallmarks of this archetype: energy crashes that feel like hitting a wall, not just tired, but physically unable to continue. The afternoon cliff, typically between 2 and 4 p.m., blood sugar instability that doesn't fully respond to dietary adjustments alone because the cortisol signal is counteracting the dietary work in real time. For insulin inflamed, nervous system first. Definitely nervous system work first to interrupt the cortisol glucose insulin cycle. Dietary interventions applied to an unstabilized HPA axis produce partial results and plateau. So this is applied after the nervous system axis is addressed. The same interventions hold. Okay? The same interventions hold. The T3 downregulated pattern. This is impaired thyroid hormone conversion. The thyroid produces T4, the storage form of thyroid hormone. T4 must be converted to T3, the active form, for your cells to use it. That conversion happens primarily in the liver and gut by an enzyme called DIO2, okay? Type 2 deiodinase, which you can think of as the enzyme that activates thyroid hormone in your cells. It is the switch that turns the storage form into the working form. Cortisol suppresses DIO2, type 2 deiodinase. Cortisol suppresses the activity directly. It also increases the production of reverse T3, which is biologically inactive, and it competes with active T3 at the receptor level. Under chronic cortisol elevation, you end up with less active T3 reaching your cells and more reverse T3 occupying the receptor sites that should be activated. Normal production, impaired activation. Now the result, well, a clinical thyroid picture that standard labs frequently miss. The standard thyroid panel tests TSH. The standard thyroid panel tests TSH and sometimes total T4. Now, both can appear normal. The production numbers look fine. The conversion problem is invisible unless you look at free T3 and reverse T3 specifically, which most standard panels do not include. The clinical hallmarks of this archetype: profound fatigue that is worse in the morning despite adequate sleep, when thyroid hormone activity is most critical for cellular energy production. Hair thinning at the temples and the outer third of the eyebrows. Cold hands and feet even in warm rooms, because T3 is the primary regulator of cellular heat production and peripheral circulation. Brain fog that is slower and heavier than cortisol fog, harder to lift, harder to push through, and the specific frustration of normal labs in the face of symptoms that are clearly real. For T3 downregulated, nervous system axis reduces the cortisol burden, suppressing conversion. Rhythm axis comes second. Okay? Circadian anchoring is directly linked to the timing of thyroid hormone metabolism. The cortisol awakening response primes thyroid hormone activity for the day. When that response is blunted by a disrupted circadian rhythm, thyroid conversion is further impaired on top of the cortisol-driven suppression. Estrogen-Stuck. This pattern is impaired estrogen clearance. Now, this is distinct from estrogen dominance as it is conventionally discussed. The issue is not production, it is detoxification. Estrogens are processed through the liver in two phases. Phase 1 modifies them. Phase 2 conjugates them, attaches molecules that make them water-soluble and excretable by bile, B-I-L-E. Cortisol burdens phase 2 liver pathways. The sulfation and the glucuronidation pathways that should be conjugating estrogens are competing for the same biochemical resources as the cortisol detoxification burden. When those pathways are overwhelmed, conjugated estrogen re-enters circulation rather than clearing. The liver and gut are recycling what they should be excreting. There is also a progesterone component. Okay? Cortisol and progesterone compete for the same precursor, the hormone pregnenolone. Under sustained cortisol demand, the body preferentially shunts pregnenolone toward cortisol production. Progesterone drops. The estrogen-progesterone ratio shifts, not because estrogen production is rising, but because progesterone is depleted. Now, the clinical hallmarks of this archetype: breast tenderness, particularly in the luteal phase or perimenstrually. Mood cycling that tracks the hormonal arc rather than external circumstances. Hip and thigh fat retention. This adipose tissue is particularly estrogen sensitive. And PMS or perimenopausal symptoms that amplify even when estrogen levels appear stable on labs. Now, for estrogen-stuck, nourishment comes third in the tri-shift, but the specifics are highly targeted. Gut-liver axis support specifically. Phase 2 detoxification requires adequate protein, methylation cofactors, and cruciferous vegetable compounds, but this work only holds when the cortisol burden that's overloading those pathways have been reduced. Now, the Estrobolome-Disrupted pattern, this is depleted gut microbiome estrogen clearing capacity. The estrobolome is a specific subset of gut bacteria that is responsible for metabolizing estrogens. Conjugated estrogens arrive in the gut via bile. They're being routed for excretion through the digestive tract. Estrobolome bacteria express an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase. Now, in a healthy estrobolome, that enzyme activity is calibrated to allow appropriate estrogen metabolism and excretion. But in a dysbiotic gut, where microbial diversity is depleted and certain bacteria are overrepresented, beta-glucuronidase activity rises. Conjugated estrogens are deconjugated and reabsorbed rather than excreted. The estrogen that should have left the body re-enters circulation. Elevated cortisol directly degrades the gut microbiome. Elevated cortisol directly degrades the gut microbiome. It disrupts tight junction integrity. It alters the inflammatory environment that governs microbial composition. The cortisol drift compounds this. Sustained HPA activation produces sustained microbiome disruption. The estrobolome cannot maintain function in an environment that cortisol is continuously degrading. Now, the clinical hallmarks of this archetype: bloating that is cyclical and tracks with hormonal fluctuations rather than specific foods. A strong mood digestive correlation. Gut symptoms and emotional state move together in a pattern that feels almost predictable once you name it. And a specific experience of gut interventions, probiotics, prebiotics, dietary protocols that produce results for a period and then plateau. The ceiling is real. It is created by the underlying cortisol burden that keeps degrading the environment those gut interventions are trying to support. For Estrobolome-Disrupted, nourishment is elevated in priority. This pattern is fundamentally a gut axis problem, but the nervous system axis must stabilize first. Microbiome interventions applied to a gut environment that cortisol is actively degrading will not hold. No supplement can break through a ceiling created by an unaddressed upstream driver. Now, I want to pause here. If you know your archetype, I want you to drop it in the chat. Now, if you don't yet, I want you to drop a question mark, okay? And I will definitely have the quiz, which takes 3 to 4 minutes, for some 5, depending on the individual. I definitely will have the link to the quiz. So I'm going to give you a few minutes. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes, a few seconds, not minutes, but seconds, to do one or the other. Now, I want to say, for those who put question marks, take the quiz before the end of today, and know that the recording from today will be more useful to you once you have the results of the quiz, your results from taking the quiz. A couple more seconds, and we're going to go ahead and move on. All right, so I just want everyone to know that you've just done the hardest cognitive work of the evening. Identifying your pattern is the work. What follows after you've identified your pattern, what follows is the roadmap. Now I'm going to show you what to do with the information that you have. Now we get to the clinical sequence. The tri-shift is a 3-axis framework for rebuilding cortisol resilience after the drift. Nervous system, rhythm, nourishment, in that order. The order is not a preference. It is not a suggestion based on what tends to work for most people. It is a clinical requirement. I'm going to show you exactly why, and I want you to hold your archetype in front of you, for those who have it, okay? I want you to hold it in front of you as I walk through each one of these axes. Axis 1, the nervous system. Why is this first? Why is this first? The nervous system axis is first because the HPA axis is the foundation on which every other intervention rests. If the HPA axis is still in high drive, every other intervention is working against the current. Are you guys listening? Think about what happens when you address blood sugar while cortisol is spiking hepatic glucose output multiple times per day. You can optimize your macronutrient ratios, time your meals precisely, use fiber sequencing, and cortisol will counteract that work with every stress activation. The glucose spike happens regardless of what you ate. Think about what happens when you try to anchor your circadian rhythm with morning light and consistent sleep times while your nervous system is activating at 2 or 3 in the morning. The cortisol signal that should be quiet during those hours is louder. Can you hear me? It's louder than the circadian anchoring signal you're trying to establish. The rhythm won't hold. Think about what happens when you seed your gut microbiome with probiotic strains and fermented foods, while elevated cortisol is degrading the intestinal barrier and actively altering the inflammatory environment those strains need to survive in. You are rebuilding in an environment that is being simultaneously broken down. The nervous system axis is not reduce your stress. It is the clinical work of lowering the set point of the HPA axis, specifically the accumulated physiological load that has built up through months or years of the drift. Rebuilding glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity so the feedback loop that closes cortisol production can actually close. For every archetype, this is the foundation. It is not optional as a first step. This slide is worth a screenshot, okay? We're moving through it, but these are the specifics. The 4-8 breathing pattern, 4 count inhale, 8 count exhale. The extended exhale activates the vagal brake and shifts autonomic tone. The ratio matters and the dose matters. A minimum of 20 continuous minutes to produce measurable HPA change. 5-minute breaks scattered through the day. Do not move the floor. NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, also called yoga nidra, 20 to 30 minutes daily. Evidence shows cortisol reduction comparable to an equivalent sleep period. Best placed in the early afternoon or before bed. Evening practice is more impactful, okay, for the drift than morning practice because the evening work is targeting the nadir directly. Morning practice reduces reactivity for the day. Evening practice lowers the floor you wake up to, okay? Now, when we look at, while establishing this axis, I want you to avoid cortisol spiking inputs. High intensity exercise acutely elevates cortisol and delays nadir completion. Late caffeine extends cortisol signaling into the window when you need it dropping. Both undermine the work. Supplement context, KSM 66 ashwagandha is the most clinically validated adaptogen for HPA cortisol reduction. The effect builds over 6 to 8 weeks. Phosphatidylserine attenuates post-exercise cortisol spikes for women who are exercise dependent and can't reduce intensity yet. Reduction first, then add. Axis 2, the rhythm axis. The rhythm axis is second because cortisol is fundamentally a circadian hormone. The cortisol diurnal curve, rising sharply in the morning, declining steadily across the day, reaching its lowest point at night, is not just a reflection of cortisol health. It is an active regulator of it. The cortisol awakening response, the spike that occurs in the first 20 to 30 minutes after waking, is a critical physiological event. It primes the HPA axis for appropriate daytime reactivity. It calibrates the system for the demands of the coming day. When the circadian rhythm is disrupted, the cortisol awakening response becomes blunted or erratic. The system doesn't get that morning calibration. It carries the prior day's cortisol burden forward. Evening cortisol, which should be completing its descent toward the nadir, stays elevated. The nervous system cannot complete its nighttime recovery. When the nervous system axis is stabilized first, the rhythm work anchors efficiently. The circadian anchoring tools that may have produced inconsistent results before, morning light, consistent wake time, evening wind down practices, produce consistent results when the cortisol floor has been lowered first. For T3 down-regulated women specifically, this axis carries additional weight. Circadian rhythm anchoring supports thyroid hormone metabolism directly. Okay? Rhythm protocols. Another one that is worth a screenshot. These are ordered by Impact on the cortisol diurnal curve. Morning light within 15 minutes of waking, 10 to 15 minutes outdoors, or a 10,000 lux box in a low light environment. This sets your brain's master clock and times the cortisol awakening response. It is the single strongest circadian anchor available. The signal must arrive before artificial light or screens. Consistent wake time, plus or minus 30 minutes, 7 days a week. More impactful than consistent sleep time. Sleeping in on weekends shifts the circadian phase and weakens the cortisol awakening response for the days that follow. Breakfast within 90 minutes of waking. Your gut and liver keep their own time. They are circadian timekeepers independent of the brain's clock. Eating at a consistent time each morning strengthens that signal and supports CAR, the cortisol awakening response completion. Evening protocol, light temperature transition after 8 p.m. Last intense exercise by 7 p.m. No caffeine after 2 p.m. These inputs delay the nadir by sustaining cortisol signaling into the window when you need it dropping. For T3 downregulators specifically, morning light plus consistent breakfast timing are the two most direct rhythm interventions for this pattern. They work on the thyroid conversion architecture, not just the cortisol curve. Nourishment. Nourishment is third, and this is almost always where women expect to start. Am I lying? No, it's the truth. Food is powerful, okay, but it is most powerful when the cortisol and circadian context allows it to work at full capacity. Applied in the wrong order, every nourishment intervention works in an environment that undermines it. The specific nourishment work differs substantially by archetype. For insulin-inflamed, blood sugar stabilization, protein density, fat timing, fiber sequencing, applied now to a cortisol axis that is producing smaller, shorter glucose spikes. The same dietary interventions that plateaued at step 1 produce sustained results at step 3 because the cortisol interference has been reduced. For Estrogen-Stuck, phase 2 liver pathway support, cruciferous vegetables for sulforaphane and indole-3 carbinol adequate protein for the amino acid precursors that sulfation requires, methylation cofactors, applied in a phase 2 environment that is no longer being consumed by cortisol detoxification burden. But did specific probiotic strains, Lactobacillus acidophilus, L. reuteri, fiber diversity, calcium D-glucarate to inhibit beta-glucuronidase, applied in a gut environment where the cortisol assault has been reduced. These interventions crossed the ceiling that the same interventions could not break through at step 1. The tri-shift sequence I just walked you through, nervous system, rhythm, nourishment, in that order, is the architecture of the programs I run. 8 weeks, built around your specific archetype. What I describe today as a framework, the pattern-specific entry points, the sequencing logic, the archetype-matched nourishment work. That is what the program delivers in practice. I'm naming it here. I'll come back to it at the close. The sequence principle. The sequence principle. Now, before we move to Q&A, I want to leave you with one clinical principle. The reason most women do not see sustained results from gut hormone interventions is not that the interventions are wrong. It is that they are applied in the wrong order to a system that is not yet prepared to receive them. Cortisol resilience is not built by reducing cortisol. It is built by rebuilding the buffer, the physiological capacity to respond to stress and recover from it fully. The buffer was degraded by the drift. The drift does not reverse on its own. The drift does not reverse on its own, but it responds directly to clinical work that is sequenced correctly for the specific pattern driving it. The tri-shift is that sequence. That is the rebuild. So we have about 5 minutes for questions, and I want to use this time well. The Q&A is where the most clinically useful things happen because your questions are specific to your pattern and your situation, and that specificity makes the answers useful to every woman in the room, not just the one asking. I'm starting with a question submitted through Instagram stories, believe it or not, and then I'll take from the chat. So, one of the questions, let's see. So I've been doing breathwork consistently for 2 years. I feel calmer during the session, but an hour later, I'm back to exactly where I started. Why isn't it holding? Okay, so this is exactly the right question, and it is one I hear almost every week, seriously, from women. What you're experiencing is a physiological rebound. It is not, okay, listen to me clearly, it is not a discipline problem. Sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, and it temporarily lowers HPA axis output. For that calm state to hold after the practice ends, the system needs a mechanism to maintain the reduced cortisol level, specifically glucocorticoid receptors that are sensitive enough to read the lower cortisol level and signal the HPA to stay down. Now, in a woman with an intact estrogen buffer, estrogen helps maintain that receptor sensitivity passively. When the buffer has thinned and receptor sensitivity has declined, there is no mechanism holding the cortisol down after the practice stops. So the system rebounds to its elevated set point almost immediately because the set point itself has not shifted. Breath practice is not the wrong tool. It is being applied to a system whose baseline set point needs to be addressed first. This is exactly the distinction between a symptom management intervention and a system level one. Now, breath work becomes significantly more effective and the calm holds for hours rather than minutes. Now, once the cortisol floor has been lowered through the nervous system axis work specific to your pattern, the practice hasn't been wasted, okay? It will carry forward. All right, let's see. Here's another good one. Okay, I've been on a serious gut protocol for 6 months. Probiotics, bone broth, elimination diet, fermented foods. My gut has improved somewhat, but I keep hitting a ceiling. What am I missing? The ceiling you're describing is one of the most common clinical experiences for women with estrobolome-disrupted and estrogen-stuck patterns. And it is real, okay? You are not imagining that. You are not doing the work wrong. Here's what's happening structurally. Your gut protocol is doing the right things, but the environment your protocol is working in is being actively disrupted at the same time. Again, elevated cortisol, it degrades the gut barrier by loosening the tight junction proteins that separate gut contents from systemic circulation. And then simultaneously, the inflammatory response to that barrier disruption alters the microbial environment, specifically in ways that disadvantage the beneficial strains that you're supplementing and advantage the opportunistic ones you're trying to reduce. So you are seeding and rebuilding in a system that cortisol is continuously breaking down. Now the protocol is not wrong, okay? The sequence is. The missing step is upstream, reducing the cortisol burden that is driving the environmental degradation. Now, when the nervous system acts as a stabilized first, the gut protocol you've already built, which is clearly sophisticated, often produces significant and sustained results fairly quickly because the work is now happening in a receptive environment. So you are not starting over, you are adding the missing first step. Okay, let's see, I have time for another one. Let's do one more. Let's do one more here. All right. So my doctor says my thyroid is normal. I have every symptom of low thyroid. How do I have this conversation with my physician? Okay. Well, I want to be careful here because your clinical relationship with your physician is yours. And I'm not telling you what to say. Okay? I'm not telling you what to say. But I can give you the clinical language that accurately describes what you may be experiencing. The standard thyroid panel in most clinical settings tests TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, and sometimes total T4. Now, both can appear in the normal reference range when the conversion problem is the issue. Okay, the production numbers are fine. The enzyme that activates thyroid hormone in your cells is what's impaired, and that doesn't show up on a standard panel. Okay, um, free T3 and reverse T3 are the specific markers that reveal the conversion picture. Free T3 is the biologically active thyroid hormone your cells use. Reverse T3 is the inactive form that competes with active T3 at the receptor level. Now, these are not included in most standard panels. The clinical language to request them from your physician. I'd like to assess peripheral thyroid hormone conversion, specifically free T3 and reverse T3, in addition to the standard panel. So, just something like that. You can ask your treating physician, and he or she, I'm sure, would be more than happy to assist you. Okay. That said, I do want to say this though. While you navigate that clinical conversation or while you wait for those labs, the mechanism driving the conversion problem is the cortisol burden. So, addressing the nervous system axis during that time is not waiting, it is directly relevant to the thyroid picture, regardless of what the labs show. Okay. For everyone else, please drop your questions. Please drop your questions in the chat, and I will answer every single one. But I want to continue and kind of wrap this up because we've been going for a minute. We've been going for a minute, but I don't want you to feel as though you cannot ask your questions or that your questions were not answered. Drop them in the chat. I will respond to each and every last one of them. All right. Before I close, one more thing for us to post in the chat. Just one word, okay? What's the one thing you're walking away with today or tonight or this morning if you're watching a replay? What is the one thing you are walking away with? Drop it in the chat. Now, we are at the close. I want to be clear about what today was and what it was not. Okay, today was a clinical briefing. The goal for today was understanding, not protocol delivery. Let me say it again. Today's goal was for understanding. It was not protocol delivery. So you came into this space with symptoms you may have been managing, compensating for, or explaining away for years, and in some cases longer than that. I wanted you to leave with a different category of explanation for those symptoms. Listen, the cortisol drift is real. It is physiological. It is not a psychological challenge to be met with better mindset practices. It is a biological shift that occurred when the estrogen buffer thinned, and it requires a clinical response that is precisely sequenced for the specific pattern it created in your body. The tri-shift is that sequence. Nervous system first, rhythm second, nourishment third, non-interchangeable. Now, what becomes possible when that sequence is followed, built for your specific archetype, not the general pattern, it is not symptom management. It is the rebuilding of the buffer itself, the physiological capacity for resilience that perimenopause, menopause removed. This is what day 91 looks like. The woman who doesn't brace for 3 a.m. anymore because it does not come, whose afternoon holds, who trusts her own cognition in those meetings, whose midsection is responding, not because she changed what she ate, but because she addressed the cortisol pattern driving the retention first, who still lives with perimenopause or menopause and always will, but has a protocol built for her specific stress physiology. That is what the correct sequence produces. I said I'd come back to what I mentioned during the tri-shift section. If today confirmed what you've been sensing, that there is a specific clinical sequence for your specific pattern, and that the approaches you've tried have been the right tools applied in the wrong order, and you want to build that sequence. My second cohort starts June 22nd. Okay? It is 8 weeks. It is built around your specific archetype. The founding rate is the same. I have not increased the price yet. The founding rate is the same, $597. Now, the wait list, you can join the wait list. It's going to be posted. Link is there on the screen, but it also will be posted in the chat so that you can always go and just, click save and sign up for the wait list. Okay. I'm only taking a small number because the amount of work that goes into this cohort, this program individually for each individual person is a lot. Okay. I have not yet decided how many. With my first cohort, I took 10. Okay. We have 10 women. Second cohort, I may increase that. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on this yet, but I'm thinking maybe 20. Okay. So that is the only time I'm going to mention this. I want all of you to know that I'm so grateful for you all who are here. I'm so grateful for everything that you have posted in the chat. Continue to post your questions. Continue to post your comments. Continue to post and share. Okay. I want to also let everyone know again that tonight's recording, the link will be sent directly to those of you who are RSVP to your email. Okay, you will receive this. It's also going to be posted in our free online community for our members who are there, and our Nourish and Flow circle. Again, it's free to join. I'm going to put the link to that also in the chat for you to go and just come on in to the group. It's free, and we do quite a bit of work in that group, and everyone works at their own pace though. Now, if you have not taken the Archetype quiz, that is the prerequisite, seriously, for everything I described today. And it is the reason the reference card that I will be sending to those of you who RSVP, you will receive a reference card. It's the reason why that reference card that I'm going to send to you, why it matters. Okay. Again, the quiz takes anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, depending on the individual. And the link is going to be also posted in the chat. It's also up on the screen. The Archetype reference card is a one-page clinical summary of how the cortisol drift expresses in each of the 5 patterns. That is going to go out to every registered attendee by email. You should get that in your inbox within 24 hours. So I want to again say thank you so much to everyone for being in this room this evening, this listen, or if you're watching the replay, thank you so much. The questions were extraordinary. I'm still sitting with a few of them. And like I said, continue to drop your questions, please, and I will answer all of them. Good to be here with you. I want you all to do good work. And also, I want to just say good night.